Working on a lot lately is taking a look at a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings of Native Americans in general. So what I thought I'd start with was to take a look at something I did a while back, which was go to Clemson University and finish my PhD at Clemson. And what's interesting, this is it. It was funny because I stayed in line with another young man who was he was from Indonesia, I think, and he had done something on insects, etc. at Clemson, and he was getting his PhD as well. So we shook hands, and I said, by the way, how long was your dissertation? Because it sounded very, very involved. And he says, about 80 pages. I said, dear God, that's my chapter 3. So mine's a little bit longer, but there's a lot of reasons for that. And the reason I brought this is because I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're talking now about schools, and there's an attempt to kind of go backwards in the schools in terms of what they teach in schools. And obviously, as somebody who loves education, I think that's a horrible mistake. We have just begun to open up some of the other things about Native groups and all different minorities and women. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunities for us to do some good things with education. And so hopefully this is a way to introduce you to, they call it revisionist history. One of the things they talk about is revisionist history. Revisionist history actually means, it's a good thing, because it means that we don't know everything there is to know yet. And my students used to ask me in class, I don't know if I did generous class as much, but one of the things they used to say is that the end of the story? I said, oh no, there's no end to the story. It's just the data that you collect and the perspectives and things that you see down the road. That's what history is all about. I don't know about if you remember back in your childhood. Mine's just a few years ago, so it's pretty fresh in mine. But we used to say that the land bridge theory was 12,000 years ago. Now there's dispute whether it was even a land bridge or not. But so therefore they said that the first people here were across that land bridge about 12,000 years ago. You remember that? Ever remember that in school? Sure. And now they're going back many, many years earlier than that, maybe 40,000 years. In some case, Goodyear in South Carolina in his day, maybe 50,000 years there's life here. We simply don't know. But it seemed like a good story at the time, so that's what we learned growing up, and it was very exciting. But it's also very exciting hearing about new possibilities. So, but to start this off, to tell you about the dissertation, it wasn't the fact that I earned my PhD with it, but it's the idea of how we approach knowledge and how historians go about it. And I consider myself a research historian, and so I'm never satisfied with the answers very much. So I'm constantly looking for more answers to different things, to different questions. And this was a long process even before I got the dissertation, because as a kid growing up, I'm going to talk about Westerns and cowboys and Indians for just a minute now, because as I was growing up, obviously, as a kid, and I still watch them. I'm sorry, I watch Gunsmoke, and I watch Tales of Wells Fargo, and anything probably with Clint Eastwood in it. I watch some of those. Outlaw Josie Wales is one of my favorite, which is also considered very historically accurate of what happened after the Civil War. So I still watch the Westerns, but growing up with the Westerns, Gunsmoke comes to mind. There's contradictions involved in Gunsmoke and some of the other ones, John Wayne movies in particular, that there's always, they envisioned Native Americans at the time were savages. They were savages. They were primitive. They weren't very primitive, as you will see. They were on the cutting edge of handling this environment very, very well, and they were actually a very advanced agricultural society. But I couldn't help but watch those. But even in Gunsmoke, they had, you remember the actor Burt Reynolds? He was, remember his role in it was he was a half-breed. Called him a half-breed on the show as a derogatory term, and he was part Comanche supposedly. And if you remember Matt Dillon was kind of the precursor of people who were taking sympathetic views of Native Americans, because he got along with them real well. And they felt a lot of honor. They wouldn't kill him because he's such a nice guy, as they would kill all the other whites because they were nasty, but he was a good guy. So, you know, it's sort of a built-in contradiction. So some of the movies that portrayed that were kind of fascinating. John Wayne, my goodness. And one of the things I remember about John Wayne, of course, when, what was it, he was in one that, where he was trying to find his niece who was captured by the Indians. They didn't know what was going to happen to her. You know what happens when the Indians get out of control and all this kind of stuff. I said, As time went on, I said, man, this just doesn't sound right. Because then he turns around and he talks about this chief and who was being rough handled by the soldiers at a fort. He says, if you touch that chief again that way, I'll shoot you, or something like that. He said he was going to do damage to the guy. So these contradictions kind of set in my mind for a while. Then as I got into, as I think about growing up in public schools, and this was mostly in New York, it was primarily in New York, and as I was going through the different grades, I was trying to think back on what we learned about Native Americans then, which obviously, I don't know about you growing up, you're a lot younger than I am, but it wasn't very much. There was cursory treatments of certain events in American history that were important, and I kind of listed some of them, if you remember it. They talk a little bit about Native Americans in the Revolutionary War. They talk about the Trail of Tears, always got top bidding, so to speak. The Little Bighorn. I'm actually doing an article on the Little Bighorn now, which was not very close to what we get with Errol Flynn, darn it, because I like Errol Flynn. And then Wounded Knee. Then by the time we get to Wounded Knee, we're into the 20th century, and from the 20th century to the present, nearly to the present, because there's been some activity lately, they all have disappeared. And just there's not any mention in textbooks very much about Native Americans. There's a little bit more now since the 1990s. And one of the things that's helped that was that really started catapulting Native Americans in the spotlight was Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves. So that became a very, very significant movie for that. But many of these treatments that I remember in the textbooks were very cursory treatments. They were generally biased towards people, white settlements. They didn't give you what I call the broader picture, the full context of what actually was happening. One of my friends has said he's very fascinated with the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I got talking to him about it, and he says, no, it was an amazing thing. I said, yes, it was. Not only were they helped by a Native American woman, but at the same time, you still have to ask yourself the question, what was lost when the West was won? Because there were some very negative things that came out of Lewis and Clark's expedition. First of all, it spearheaded other investigations into the West, and those investigations brought smallpox with them, and it wiped out an awful lot of people in the West. And they were so bent and determined to put these Native Americans and take the land, put them on reservations, that they decided to take away their ability to eat correctly, which is kill all the buffalo they possibly could. And the buffalo almost killed right out of existence in the West. Just in the 20th century have they made any kind of comeback. So we need to think about those things when we take a look at American history. And so if that's, some lady said in reaction to, we need to just stick to the facts in history classes. If you really want to know the facts, it ain't pretty. It's a very vicious history at times in our history. So what we got to do, I think, is to think about incorporating and request in our schools a broad interpretation of some of those things. So, and not only was it the Westerns that we watched, and maybe the movies that we got, and don't forget John Wayne also paid for The Alamo, the movie The Alamo, which he stars Davy Crockett. Did you ever read anything about Davy Crockett? He wasn't any bigger than me. John Wayne was starring as Davy Crockett. So I don't know if you watch Reacher, any of the Reacher movies. Know anything about Jack Reacher? Well, Jack Reacher was about 6'5", about 250 pounds, and Tom Cruise started in the movie. It just doesn't work. As a matter of fact, the author said we'll never do that again because it just didn't work very well. So, but that's only one aspect of it. The other thing that made me be very concerned and question the history that we're teaching was the other way in which we learned about this was our textbooks. Textbooks, by the way, are big business, and I wrote a lot about this in my dissertation. As a matter of fact, the way that textbook gets determined in the classroom is the state that can spend the most money on textbooks. I think you kind of get the idea they can't cater a textbook to every single state or every single school district, so they got to mass produce a textbook. So who gets the green light for the textbook is the one that come up with enough money for it. So I just mentioned where one of the places that I studied for a little while, or areas that I studied for a while, and you'll never guess which state has the most money for textbook historically. Now, this was in 2004, 2005 when I was doing this writing, so I'm not sure if some other states have superseded it, but I tend to doubt it. The number one state in purchasing textbook was none other than Texas. You wonder why we learned so much about the Alamo? And the Alamo is just a blink in history. not really that much of a meaningful situation. That, of course, that was Davy Crockett Legend and Jim Bowie and Travis, Trent, and all those kind of guys. So, textbook business. Now, where we learn history in schools is in grades 3, 4, 5, 8, and 11. So I decided to do something about it in terms of the textbooks and how they present their information about Native Americans. So I wanted to do a textbook analysis, and this is what came out of that textbook analysis. It seems there's a lot of pages in here. So I went around South Carolina. First of all, I contacted Columbia and said, do you have any textbooks that I could borrow, because I want to take a look at them. And within the textbooks that are on the bookshelves in South Carolina schools, in those grades that I mentioned, were 800 questions relating to Native Americans. 800 questions. We call them pedagogical exercises. And if you remember the old textbooks, there were questions at the end of sections in the chapter, and there were questions at the end of the chapter. And I put them all together and called them pedagogical exercises. So I began to evaluate those pedagogical exercises, and I wanted to see what kind of value they had for students. Now, so then you have to come up with a way, well, how do you evaluate them? Well, there's something in education we call Bloom's taxonomy of questions. And what that has to do with is level that you want your students to think at, or what you push them to think at, whether you want to give it rote memorization, or whether you want to have a really good, tough essay and let them think about some cause and effect relationships. And the higher level you go, the better the questions are for students understanding a broader picture of it. And we're always looking to try to do broader pictures of information. So when I began to analyze those questions, and Bloom's taxonomy, by the way, I'll tell you the 6 levels of it. The first one, as a matter of fact, you do a mnemonic device to figure out Bloom's taxonomy. So, and if you take the first letter of each word that I'm telling you, I kind of made one up for myself, which is kind of crazy, but at the same time it works. Kryptonite can always aggravate Superman's ego. So there's 6 levels to Bloom's taxonomy. The K in kryptonite stands for knowledge. The second one is comprehension, can always, and the A is for application. And what we did, we said the knowledge and the comprehension, we'll say that those are lower levels. So my professor and I were trying to give as much leeway as we could that these questions were higher level questions. So we will put the first 2 as lower level questions, and everything else would be a higher level question, in hopes that this is what they're after, is they're getting the students to think in these classrooms and broaden their imaginations and broaden their understanding of what they heard. And the other ones were application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Evaluation being the highest one of Bloom's taxonomy. And evaluation questions, there is no really right or wrong answer if you can provide decent evidence for that information. So, on the basis of that, those 800 questions, my professor and I decided, okay, let's evaluate 200 of those questions, just for the sake of analysis, and find out where they fall in Bloom's taxonomy. And I don't think it comes as any surprise that 95% of those questions fell to the first 2 categories, the lowest levels of rote memorization and of Bloom's taxonomy. And therefore, there was very, very, very low percentage of anything that got those students to think at higher levels. Now, I'll just give you an example of how that might work. Say, for example, you want to look at the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears is in every textbook, and most people think it was a heinous thing probably to do. But one of the questions that was in the back of the chapter, or one of the sections, said, who was the chief of the Cherokee during the Trail of Tears? That's interesting to know, but it's just a real quick, comprehensive knowledge question. It's just a knowledge question. And John Ross, and I think he was 132nd Cherokee, but nonetheless, John Ross. Here you had an opportunity for the students to say, evaluate what you think about the Trail of Tears. In Georgia, which was typical of what happened around the United States, in the West as well, and that's what caused the Little Bighorn, was a violation of a treaty. And the Cherokee had a treaty in Georgia with Georgia. Well, guess what was found in Georgia? Gold. And so, guess who's going to leave? They're going to get the Cherokee leave that area, so they forced them out. What's kind of funny too, interesting in the research I was trying to do, I was trying to find out if there were any gathering points in South Carolina, so if they were part of the actual staging area for the trail tiers. And as yet, unless I come across some soldiers or people, their records who were in the area at the time, where there doesn't seem to be. It was in northern Georgia where there's a lot of collecting points. Not that some didn't escape into the mountains through South Carolina, because they certainly did, but most everything was outside of it. So, and just imagine picking up your entire family and having to just leave the land that you know all your life, move across a river into a strange land where other people were, and they might not be so happy that you came into that particular land. So this is bringing these two things together, what I learned in school and what I saw on TV and in TV shows kind of put a lot of doubt in me that we were dealing with Native Americans correctly, and that can be for a lot of different groups in our society. So anyway, so that's where I wanted to start talking a little bit about the actual stuff that I did with the Cherokee in this situation, and using, first of all, we tried to use original documents as much as possible. I'm going to show you, and I got a lot of the documentation in my dissertation, but there's awfully good pieces out there. One of these, because I think you used to sell this. This is from Ann Sheriff put this together. She's a 4th grade teacher who got her students to put these primary sources together in this book, and it is invaluable if you want to study a little bit about the Cherokees. You got to be interested in looking at little tiny things that are said about trade, but there's a lot that are said about the Cherokee. So what I wanted to do is kind of refute a few of the things that are said about the Cherokee in here. And now, many of these people who were first engaged with the Cherokee came in, I'm going to deal with basically the 1700s, I'm not through in a very basic way. And the first one came into Tugelo Town. Now, Tugelo Town. Now, you have to envision, some people say, well, how did those guys get up here in the first place? Well, they came up the Savannah River, and as you get closer upstate, then everything branches off. So you got the Tugelo on one side, and you got Seneca River, and then you've got the Kiwi River on the other side. So two of the biggest towns of the Cherokee at the time was Tugelo, down near the Georgia border. Then you got the town of Kiwi here further up in the upstate. And that's where a lot of the traders went to. So one of the things that you first do when you go into a territory like this, very likely, is you take military men with you, because you want to know who the enemy is if there's potential enemies in the area. And so there's a lot of journals that were left at the time. One of the journals was by a guy named, you'll love this, George Chicken. He was a colonel. George Chicken in 1715, and this is in his journal. And he says, Colonel Maurice Moore went to Tugelo to persuade the Cherokee to renew their friendship. So he'd already had some contact with them. And I'm going to try to read through this. He doesn't write exactly the English that I remember that I studied. But he says, Thursday, ye 29, this day we drew up our men and marched to Tugelo, where ye Indians met us with eagle tails, feathers, and dresses, and made their ceremonies. Then came some old men with black drink. Black drink is, if you drink the black drink, you'll get a buzz, a real specific buzz. And they drank that a lot before the games. Like they played stickball, which is the forerunner of lacrosse, and so they really like the black drink. When they returned back, they told us to march into U-Town. They made a lane there, and the men around the around the roundhouse. Now the roundhouse, if you take a look, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the village, how they look. If you look on the front of this, you'll see the village there, and the largest structure in there, it's got smoke coming out the top, and it's called the council house. They call it the roundhouse because it was round. And so that's where they went for meetings and all that. So right away, they weren't going to take these people and beat them up. They were going to take them in and treat them really well. So they were a friendly group, to be sure. And then they met they call him a conjurer, Charity Hagee, sat and stayed to receive us. We took him by the hand. We stepped back, then he came and strode before us with his hands open to receive 2 white flags which he did then gave them to one of his men and set one on top of the roundhouse. So they had a very positive meeting. They got along very well with this, and basically the Cherokee they were considered eventually one of the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes in the Southeast for sure. And so this was a very, very positive encounter. Okay, so that was one of the earlier ones. So I wanted to take a look at something a little bit later on, and the best one I could find in terms of this was going to be William Bartram. If I can find the stuff here. Just a minute. And William Bartram he was a botanist who was out of Philadelphia, as was his father. And so I'll have to come back to him in a minute. Okay, let me go to so Bartram, by the way, he was able to travel into Cherokee country, and he said he crossed a number of the rivers, headed up into the mountains towards the upper villages and upper towns. And I got to keep in mind that the Cherokees occupied about 8 states at this time, and so it was not unlikely that if whatever town you went to, and this is kind of in the early stages of it before the American Revolution, the Cherokee were divided up into clans, and there were 7 clans. Which is their number, and that's a very spiritual number to them. And everything involved has 7s in it. And so when they went to other towns, every single town would have 7 of the clans in those towns when they were full towns. Now, because of warfare and stuff, they had to combine the towns, and you wouldn't find necessarily. And the clan. I have to see if I can name the clans for you. I always forget one of them. See, we had the Potato Clan. You had the long hair, you had the red paint, you had the blue, you had the Deer Clan, you had the Wolf Clan, and you had the Deer Clan, Wolf Clan, and Bird Clan. And those were the 7. So you felt very comfortable if you were a Cherokee from this area to go into the Overhills and to go into any Cherokee towns because you would find relatives there. They were the same clan. So I made it pretty, very, very interesting. That's why the Cherokee are so very close. Okay. Okay. So that was very interesting part of it too. So they in 1788 there was a guy who also entered Cherokee country, and his name was what's that book? That's a huge book you got out there now.
Andre Michaud.
Andre Michaud. And he also was a botanist, and so but he was in a different territory. So I was looking through some of his. There's Margaret Seaborn writes a little piece on his, which is very important to read, but because she describes day by day some of the things that he does. And he said one day when they crossed the Tugelo and traveled from Seneca, which is a distance of 19 miles. It's interesting. So he's at Tugelo town, he went to Seneca town. He and his guide slept at an Indian village. Chief of the village greeted them courteously, and he was about 70 years old. He offered to guide Michaud, and he had supper with them, which was fresh deer meat, venison, bread of cornmeal mixed with sweet potatoes. His guide knew how to speak Indian, but he said they were very courteous people to them, and they were able to sleep there, and he said the wife of the chief roasted maize, which they were very good at, is raising corn, with hot ash sifted in an earthen pot, hominy mixed with brown sugar, and so they ate very well too, and they all were able to sleep where they wanted to, and that sort of thing. So it was a beautiful situation for those guys to be part of. If I can find his comments, but I also have let me look here just a second. William Bartram, he did something really spectacular. He traveled all over this area. He was in Florida, a lot of different areas. officer. But what he did, as he was traveling up, he came into contact with none other than what you might call the head man of all the Cherokee at the time. His name was, actually it's pronounced Atacola, but we called him Atacola for whatever reasons. And this was at a time during the Revolutionary War era that it wasn't necessarily a good thing to proceed up into the mountains where the Cherokee were, because they were fairly hostile to a lot of whites. But Bartram apparently was very special to them. And so as he was climbing up there, he noticed ahead of him, as he was riding his horse, there's a contingent of Cherokee coming his way, and he could tell by the accoutrements that the guy in the lead was none other than Atacola. So out of respect for Atacola, he pulled his horse off the path, because it was a narrow path, and allowed Atacola and his contingency to go by. As they went by, Atacola stopped, turned his horse around, and went back and talked with Bartram. And he shook his hand and thanked him for moving, and asked him where he was from. And if he remembers John Stewart down in Charleston, they had this great conversation. And he says, and he gave him something, and he says, "You will have no problem traveling through Cherokee country. You're safe." And so that was the second encounter that he had with the Cherokee at the time. Another time he visited the town of Watoga, and in Watoga he stayed overnight at the chief's house and was served supper. And William Bartram had actually lost his way a little bit, couldn't find the path. So the next morning after the visit, he was able to, the chief on foot walked with William Bartram for about 2 miles to get him back on the path, shake his hand, and say, have a great trip. So this was not necessarily, I mean, these guys can be rough at times, but they try to be very, very cordial most of the time. So if you got any questions, just hop in and ask them. They're fine. Don't mean to ramble on and on here. So now the other one I put on the little brochure, besides Andre Michaud, because of all the stuff that he was involved with. And you'll need, if you ever buy that book out there, you need a wheelbarrow to get it out. It's got a lot of information when it shows journals. But I also put on there Henry Timberlake. Now he wasn't actually in the lower towns. He was in the overhill towns, and he was there to as sort of the military, civilian American part of dealing with the Cherokee. But he was very well liked. But one of the things that he saw popular in those overhill towns was what they called chunky, the game of chunky. Now, as you will look at the one page at the bottom here, it shows these two, what they call discoidal discs, and these are, they're beautiful if you've ever seen them. And I was able to see them at Pumpkintown. I'll come back to that story in just a minute. But this was a game that the Cherokee loved to play and loved to bet on. So what you do, you'd have 2 warriors up here, side by side, and they would compete with these discs. And then what they would do is they would roll the disc out, and wherever that disc stopped, they'd try to get the closest to their spear. So whoever hit closest to that disc with their spear would win that round. And people bet on the rounds. And some of them bet themselves right out of all their possessions that time, so they really got into this game really well. But what's kind of fascinating is that they said that chunky was played along the Mississippi River. They found a lot of these discs there. We found these at Pumpkintown, so that shows that they had them in this area. And I think they've found some others as well in this area. So it's quite an amazing game. So that was, also the game of stickball was very important to them. Stickball is the forerunner of lacrosse, and they absolutely love that. I got to show you some photographs of these guys preparing and playing stickball. But if you ever get a chance, there's a writer by the name of Thomas Males who writes a really good piece on the Cherokee and shows how they were dressed to play lacrosse. And they always would talk about the ball game and doing the ball game. But the other one you might not want to look at too much, although, and this supposedly is Mooney, and he's taking what they call a scratcher, and he's scratching this guy. There's a lot of bloodletting that led into this game of stickball. It was an honor to do it, and they lost a lot of blood. It was down their arms, it was on their chest, it was on their legs, and it drew blood with everything. They could use a bird's claw or anything that was fairly sharp to let blood, and then it shows, and it got to be a fairly violent sport at times. There was not a lot of rules necessarily, and some guys could come out with broken legs or beat up pretty good. So, and I guess this was the way to keep guys in shape for any kind of combat they were ever in. So that was something else that was very important to understanding the research. So it was Timberlake that kind of popularized the notion that they played this game of chunky so much. Any questions so far? Yeah. Okay. Now the other one I want to tell you is there's another facet to the Cherokee that is also amazing to me, is one of the chapters I read about the myths and legends. And they actually had, before I get into that too, there's another little piece I got here, and I can pass these around if you want to look at them. But there's a little guy here with what they call the priest, and it's not a religious priest as we understand, but it's the guy that sometimes was the head of some of these towns. And they selected kids who of different clans to be part of the priesthood. So they would take them out by themselves, and they would talk to them a lot. And sometimes in the wintertime, they would take them down into an underground roundhouse, so to speak, and talk to them about the legends, and they'd stay there and teach these kids. Because they want, now these were the peace chiefs, by the way. They couldn't fight. They could defend, but they couldn't kill anybody. So that was very important in Cherokee society as well. So the guy that he's raising could not be a warrior if he wouldn't be in the priesthood. And it was a high honor to be part of the priesthood, to be sure. This was by the way, this was a very democratic society. And I think women will like it because women actually kind of ruled the roost in Cherokee society. Now when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because the guys had more likelihood of being killed in some sense of warfare. It doesn't have to be warfare, they could be off climbing into the mountain and fall and not come back, break a leg or something like that, not be able to return. So the women ran the business of the village. They were the ones who were the agriculturalists. They were the ones that did, the guys helped to prep the fields for them, but it was the women who actually did the planting and the harvesting and many of those kinds of things. We've been talking, I think, to some of you tonight, and talked about it was a matrilineal society. So it was important who your mother was, it didn't matter who your father was. So if you said, I'm part of the Bird clan, well, that would mean that your mother was of the Bird clan, so you would be of the Bird clan. And they couldn't marry within clans, they had to marry from outside the clans, but it's always the woman who was the important part of the clan. How are we doing on time, Jennifer? We're good? Okay. So that was something that was also very important. And he did a lot of this from, Mooney was very important. He wrote a lot of this stuff in the late 1800s, and there's several others that were with John Ross, for example. We had one guy that was with John Ross, and John Ross was I mentioned before, during the Trail of Tears, that time period, he was the principal chief. And the guy that he had with him, actually, what he wrote about the history of the Cherokee and a lot of the ceremonies was so important that they put it in the Newberry Library up in Chicago. So if you really want the background information on the Cherokee, that's one place that you can head for and look that over. Okay. So, anything else? Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit of a story too. Hopefully I can find that. Yeah. They had, I did a chapter on myths and legends of the Cherokee too, because there's several creatures that you had to watch out for, and they fought each other, as a matter of fact. One was the Klanawa, which was, we probably call it a South American condor today, but it was probably theoretically bigger than the South American condor, which is a pretty big bird. And these were birds that were very vicious, could be very vicious at times, maybe kill people. And then there was the Utena, which was this massive snake. and he was very, very hard to kill. As a matter of fact, I wish I had Nancy Baskett's stuff here, but because she makes fun of the Shawano warrior who actually killed one of the Utanas. And the Utana was so big that it looked like a tree stump, and it's just constantly this huge snake. And there's only one way that you kill it, was to shoot it in the heart of its third ring on his body. And nobody was able to do it. But this one Shawano warrior said, I think I can kill that snake for you. And he was going to be killed by the Cherokee because they were enemies of the Cherokee. And he says, if you save me, I'll get rid of the Utana for you. And so the Cherokee agreed. If you get rid of the Utana, we'll let you live. And he may not live through the Utana, but I guess he thought that was the lesser of two evils. So he went out and he was able to shoot the Utana and strike it in the heart. And they said that the Utana, as it was rolling down, boulders would move and all this kind of stuff, just this massive snake. And he did end up killing it, but as a result, one drop of blood hit the warrior in the forehead, and it caused what they call a carbuncle, a growth in his head. He couldn't see it. Everybody else could see the growth, but because the Utana was magical and it had all this power, he wasn't able to detect it. But that was the story of the Utana, that he was finally killed and the Cherokee people were saved. And you wonder why the Cherokee wrote about these mythical things. And one of the theories that I have is that they want to keep their kids safe. You know, you could, or even the young warriors. I mean, go off in the mountain. One drop of blood hit the warrior in the forehead, and it caused what they call a carbuncle, a growth in his head. He couldn't see it. Everybody else could see the growth, but because the Utana was magical and had all this power, he wasn't able to detect it. But that was the story of the Utana, that he was finally killed and the Cherokee people were saved. And you wonder why the Cherokee wrote about these mythical things. And one of the theories that I have is that they want to keep their kids safe. You know, you can, or even the young warriors. I mean, go off in the mountains can be very treacherous. So they came up with these stories to say, be careful when you're out there. You know, so try to stay a little closer to home and take care of yourself. But among their myths and their legends was a story about the bluebird and how the bluebird got its color. And I want to read that to you because this lady lady just loved this so much. And I put this as the last story in the book. And I had a guy review the book that I had written, and he said, I love that story, and it is pretty neat. So they were excellent storytellers, certainly much better than I could be. But it goes, long ago, when all creatures were made, many of the birds did not yet have the colors they now have. Bluebird was one of those birds. In the beginning, he was a very small white bird. This was not a good color to be. Wherever he went, his white color caused him to stand out so all could see him. One day, a small boy was hunting this new blowgun. By the way, the blowgun is basically the first weapon that children would use. Both boys and girls learn how to use the blowgun very effectively. And if you've ever seen a blowgun and how it's used effectively, it could kill people. There's no doubt about it. It wasn't necessarily as lethal all the time as an arrow from a bow, but it could still catch your attention. He wanted to show his grandmother he was going to be a great hunter. He decided to kill a few birds for his grandmother. The meat would make good stew, and she could make good use of the feathers. He sat silent below the many trees and peered through the branches. At last he spied a flutter of white and saw the bird land on a branch in the tree across from him. He lifted his blowgun and took aim. The dart struck the bird in the chest, but it did not strike the heart, which would have killed the bird. The small white bird dropped to the ground and lay quiet and stunned from the pain of the dart. The small boy picked it up. Thinking the bird was dead, he secured him to his belt with the other birds he had taken. Grandmother was very proud. Now, you could call a lot of people grandmother, so if somebody was older, you could be an aunt or whatever on the mother's side, grandmother, or even the grandfather on the father's side. But the grandmother was the name that they most often used. Grandmother was very proud of her small grandson when he arrived home with the game he had taken. When grandmother began to prepare the small white bird for cooking, he began to sing for her. When he stopped singing, she wiped a tear from her eye and asked how she could repay him for the beautiful song. He told her that if she would take him to water with her every morning for 7 days, the water would help heal him. The next morning, grandmother took the small white bird to a beautiful lake. She carried the bird to the side of the lake, and the little bird began to sing as he flopped into the water. Grandmother joined him there, and together they sang and welcomed the new day as the sun rose, each thanking the Creator for such a beautiful world in which to live. Nice philosophy. 7 days, Grandmother and the little white bird went to water and sang together. When the little bird rose from the water on the 7th day, he was no longer white. He was blue as all bluebirds are today, except for his breast, where the blood from the wound had stained his feathers. He sang brilliantly for Grandmother and thanked her for his life. He told her the color of his feathers would always remind him of her and her people, and because of her kindness and mercy, he and his descendants would continue to follow her people and sing for them in the mornings. This is how the bluebird became blue and red, and why he still sings each day. He sings as long as the Cherokee people exist in the world. We are still here. So the bluebird is a very special bird for them. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts or questions on different things in the Cherokee that you can think of that you didn't know before and want to find out about? Chime right in. It's your time. I like questions and answers sometimes too. Anything on the map that stands out to you that you want to look at? They called it the real people, Aniyunwiya. That's what they call themselves, and that's the real people. Showed you this, and this is also a map. By the way, you can also purchase this map full size. Jennifer's got one out here, and that's also something I put together. And the guy from Clemson helped me put the full size maps together. And I had the Margaret Seaborn map, which was done before all the computerized type of things were capable. And it hung on my wall, and I can tell you that thing is blistered with marks that I put on it. So they came in very happy because I was very, very excited about being able to visit some of these sites, or as many as I possibly could. And some of these, of course, are going to be underwater. But so I wouldn't want you to go down there. But there are a lot that are still above water that you'll be able to locate. And we have quite a number of historical markers in the area too, for that to indicate the area near where they were. And it's not hard to find in this area, especially. It's so funny because when we go to Pumpkin Town, we get to this crossroads that leads to the site not too far up the road. And if you look to your right, it drops down quite a bit to the creek bed, and it's just this incredible lowland field. And that's exactly where they did all their villages, because they needed the bottomland, because the bottomland was the most fertile. And I drive my wife crazy because we've been by there 30, 40 times because we like to go cycling up in Greenville. And I said, I can bet you that somebody looked down there. There's a lot of village sites that we can locate. She says, yes, I know. But if you go up a little bit further, that's where one of the sites was from up in there. I was able to work on that site in Pickens County. And they were able to find some evidence that they carbon dated. It goes back at least 10,000 years at that site. So if we came across the land bridge at 12,000, that means within 2,000 years they had to hustle out here to be there. So I don't know if all that works very well. But if you look at the map too, I believe I located 27 documented towns on here. That doesn't mean that's all there were, but that's the ones that have been documented, number one. And number two, that doesn't mean they were all occupied at the same time because they moved around. One of the times that they moved around was if you look at the names of some of the villages down along the Tugelo, you'll find that the same names of villages were up in the upper state, around Oconee County and Pickens County. And there's a reason for that. They had a lot of battles between themselves and the Creek Indians. And the Creeks raised heck with them at some points in time in the 1750s. And so the Cherokee decided to abandon the buildings, their villages along the Tugelo, and head upstate. So what they did, and called upstate at the time, but up around Pickens County, Oconee County line, and they built their new towns there. So there's East Etoy, and there's a number of others that were there. And it's also fascinating that if you look on the Tugelo right in here, there's about 7 or 8 towns that are not very far apart. I call that the major metropolitan area of the Cherokee. It's fascinating because apparently that was a very fertile area, and they could make a good living there as well. So a lot of these Tamasi, a lot of these have historical markers, and we've got 2 that we put up recently. One's Iche, that's up, and what's the one over by South Park, or South Cove.
It's not ready yet.
Not ready yet,
Yeah.
but that's going to be.
Cane Creek.
Cane Creek,
Cane
that's
Creek.
right, Cane Creek, which supposedly, according to some of the writing, was one of the last villages. We're not exactly sure because there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts with that. Was one of the last Cherokee villages to survive in the 18th century, right into the 1880s or 1780s or 1790s. But again, you can see it made sense where they built their villages because look at all the waterways that they could deal with. And when you came upstate from Charleston, you come up the Savannah River or go down to Charleston, you can take these waterways very easily. So the travel was quite easy for them at the time. Okay. There's also this idea that, oh yeah, if you look on the back of it, I forgot about that. That's Nancy Basket does baskets, lots of weaving with different materials. And this was what I called you with the Shawana warrior. And see the carbuncle on his forehead?
Oh, yeah.
That's the blood from the Uktana. So yeah, that's what she did. So this has a lot of information in. The trail trees are a little debate about the trail trees. It would be if these were marker trees that the Cherokee actually formed at the time or helped to form at the time. Unless they did it in more modern times, a lot of these marker trees wouldn't be here anymore. They'd probably be dead and gone by now. Just depending on, we saw one tree in New York State that's over 1,000 years old, right? So there are some that can live to remarkably old ages, but and that doesn't mean that the more modern Cherokee didn't do the same thing because they wanted to recreate some of the old traditions. So that's possible too, but it'd have to be at least a couple hundred years old, maybe 300 years old in order. So we don't know, depending on where they are, but we've been able to locate several of these, and they are unusual. And my understanding is when they were doing work up on the mountain, around Mount Rest, that they did have a Cherokee working with them, and he asked them not to cut those trees because they're sacred trees. And so if you go back on some of those dirt roads, they do take some winding turns at times. And we go back to one place where there's a huge marker tree back
Where
there.
the gun range is.
Or the gun range, yeah, there still is or was, that's right. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments about this?
Are there descendants of Cherokee in Oconee County today?
There may be. We were actually part of a clan called the LaVere clan. There was no LaVere clan. The Cherokee is just what they decided to name themselves. But most of that is anecdotal. So we heard that our great grandmother was such and such. Really don't know. The vice chief of the LaVere clan, Winston West, we're quite sure that he was descended from. I think her name was White. Her last name was White, and supposedly she was on the Trail of Tears and was escorted out of the state to the west. Well, I don't know how far to the west she got, but she did apparently return. And she was from Georgia originally, but she came across the border and came into South Carolina. So Winston's a pretty straightforward guy and knows his history pretty well. The others say, well, I've heard the story that my great-great-grandmother was part Cherokee, but we really don't. It's hard to tell. Yeah.
Most of the artifacts, the points and all that you find walking around like Killwoods or Cassie or just out in the fields, how is it possible to date those? I mean, are they pre-European for the most part?
They couldn't date those because they're on the surface.
Yeah.
So what they have to do is, the best thing to do is be able to dig down.
Right.
Where nobody's touched it, because once you touch it, you tainted it, and they can't get a good carbon dating on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why in Pumpkin Town we were very careful to dig down, and that's there was another volunteer like myself that when they found these chunky stones there, we heard that click. Mm-hmm. It's like flies to honey. We want to see what you get. It's like I said, it's Christmas almost every minute, and that's what she found. So what you do is, well, you wear gloves for one thing, but you very carefully extract that stuff. Even stuff that we were sifting, we would either have gloves, and if we found it, we might call the archaeologist over and say, what would you like us to do with this?
So what did the chunky stones date?
That's a good question. I don't know what they ended up dating on those. If they might not carbon dated those. But I think what they found interesting about the 10,000 years is oftentimes they find fire rings, and you can tell that they were kind of manipulated by humans. And I think that's what they found was the oldest part of it. And that was the second site that was in that particular area, probably a quarter of a mile apart from you. It wasn't too far. It was on the Robertson farm, which is right on the border of Pickens County and Greenville County. And as a matter of fact, what got me going with Pumpkin Town was there's an article in the Greenville News about it, and they talked about the Robertson farm, what he found, and I told Vanessa, my daughter, I said, you know, I want to do that all my life, and I'm sick and tired of saying I want to do it, I want to do it. Let's go do it. So put them in the car, we headed out there. Mr. Robertson happened to be standing outside, and he walked up, and I shook his hand, and I pulled my Clemson card. I gave one of my business cards, and I said, I'm from Clemson University, and I was just really interested. He was so gracious, and he said, sure, I'll show you where it was. And he showed him around his field. He told us how to look for pieces. So if it's broadcast out, there's not much you can do. But if you're digging down, it would be nice if they were real careful with it, because we'd like to know a lot more about what was going on at the time. I think we all had pieces in our hand after a while. And one of the stories that I understand from Mr. Robertson is that a team came out because they knew about the site. And Mr. Robertson, if you ever saw the trunk of his car, he had one of these old style, I don't know if it was a Buick or Plymouth, but the front part of it was raised up a little bit because he had so many artifacts in the back of it from the stolen artifacts, and he carried them around everywhere with him. And so he said, the archaeologists want to come out and said, we want to dig in the spot over here. And he says, yeah, but the town site's right over here. And they said, no, we think it's over here. And he says, well, this is my property, and I say it's over here. So you have your choice. You either dig there or don't go at all. They dug there, and it wasn't 2 days, and they found the site, and they were able to outline it. It was just where he said it was. He's a pretty sharp old guy.
Yeah. I know that the Cherokee side, they come out and did some work before they actually started digging, finding it was a plowed field. They grew corn and different crops in it for years, and they could find different surface artifacts, and they flagged it. At least this is the way it explained to me. And when they found the largest concentration of those surface artifacts, they kind of decided this is where we should dig. And it was.
And they had what they call middens, and every year they took all their pottery and everything they used for cooking, etc., and they broke it all and started fresh with new ones. It's just a ceremony they did every year. It's a cleansing ceremony every year. So if you could find one of those middens buried down there, and we found some pieces of pottery that sometimes were that big. I not only worked at Pumpkin Town, but I worked a little bit at Oconee site too. We didn't find a lot there, but we did find some pretty nice pieces of pottery. And local people said you're looking at the wrong side anyway. I wasn't the archaeologist. The archaeologist was the one that decided. Apparently he took some old coordinates, and that's where he found it. But it was on a hill. It's on a pretty good rise. And usually they built their towns on the lowlands right next to the rivers, not too far from them. Just what they call it, the freshens, to keep the spring rain off them. And that's why they built the mounds. The mounds weren't prayer mounds. They were mounds to put your village, your council house on. That was the point of them. And that's because when in the springtime, when the river might have overflowed, you'd still be dry by climbing up on top and going to the sharp people. And the clans would go into the council house as clans. So you'd say, well, here's your clan, here's such and such all around there, so you could tell who they were at any particular point in time. Fascinating. Anything else? All right. Well, that's about all I got for tonight. I thought we covered a lot of material here. And it can take a long time to get through all the stuff we know about the Cherokee or that I've researched. Vanessa can tell you. This has been a labor of love for me for a lot of years. I think my first publication that came out was 2010. So here we are still doing it. And my dissertation was 2004, so I did a lot of writing before that. I'm gonna just tell you this about the dissertation. I had to do this pretty fast. I was doing something else before. You get 5 years to do your dissertation. And for the first 3 years, what I was doing was trying to compare how teachers in the classroom taught general level classes versus college prep classes. And my assumption was, didn't get a chance to do it, was that they dummied down the courses for what they consider the dumber kids. Just because they don't get good grades don't mean they're dummies. It means they can be really sharp. And then they did more enticing things for the kids who were in the higher levels. And I taught both. I taught regular classes, and they get mad at me because I make them think and give them essays. And no matter what classes we were in, Jennifer can tell you this, they did essays as well as multiple choice or something like that. So, make them think. And so, anyway.
Is Kiwitown still, there was a museum off Route 11 at one time that had, is that still there? Is it, it's been years, since 20 years?
No, it's not there. The Kiwi Talks Way, no, it's not there.
It's not there anymore?
No.
What they do with all the artifacts they have there?
Went to the Cherokee Museum.
I'm sorry?
The Cherokee Museum down the street.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
But most of the artifacts had been stolen by the time.
Because they took them out of the kiosks and they just dropped them.
Do you know Jerry Wolf?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to meet him.
Yeah, very nice meeting. Very nice meeting. Yeah. He liked the University of North Carolina. I don't know how they played all the time. It's fun. Okay. And the Cherokee in North Carolina, there's still some of the ceremonies that they do, and they have. If you're able to go through the museum, it's good. And they're what's called the bookstore, gift shop type thing. That's got some nice stuff in it too as well. So it's worth going in there and take a look at some of that stuff. Well, we can do this again on lots of topics. We can do it with also women's roles and men's roles in the society, what they did. So if you're interested, we'll set it up.
Very interesting, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming.